You will? Oh, okay. Well, then, welcome everyone to my presentation about Christianity, Buddhism, and eventually the Jedi. Because, well, as we all know, our particular spiritual system is very, very syncretic. What syncretism means is that it has many different parts from many different spiritual systems, religions, faiths, call them whatever you want, but they're there. And of course, some of the most important or the most major parts of what the Jedi mean, at least from their conceptual level in fiction, comes from these two particular ways of understanding the world, which are Christianity and Buddhism. I'm sure there's no surprise or objection there. There are, of course, many others that come to create the Jedi melange, Taoism, perhaps many different indigenous beliefs, and many other ideas that sort of sing in the same choir of understanding. But these two, particularly in the way that they look and the way they behave, definitely influence the way that Jedi exist on screen and by the looks of it, also off screen as well, because for all of us, these things seem to be very, very powerful, even if on an influential level and not on a direct level, so to say. And these two traditions specifically link us as human beings to thousands of years going back of tradition and understanding and spirituality in a relatively unbroken chain. But in order to understand how these things interacted, we have to take a look at actual history. And I do believe that many people don't really understand, or rather, don't have a full knowledge of just how interconnected these two systems really, really are, because we often tend to believe that they sort of met up in recent times, but it's not really true. What we're going to discover together is that these two systems have basically been influencing each other in various ways from the very beginning. And that's why I said that there's over 2,000 years of shared history, because there really are 2,000 years of shared history ever since well, Buddhism is a lot older than Christianity, but you will see a lot of Buddhist influence in Christianity, not just on a thought level, but also on a ritual level as well. And we will see just how these two very, very similar systems ended up on opposite ends of conflicts throughout history. So, as I was saying, we definitely have a lot of syncretism in our order, and we have to understand that our particular idea of syncretism is based around what was going on in the 20th century, when a lot of scholars started going beyond what was dogmatic and started blending a lot of spiritual systems together in order to find a shared truth. Of course, we know about Joseph Campbell, but on screen, and the greatest inspiration for all of us, whether we would like to admit it or not, was George Lucas's work when he created Star Wars. But he was pulling from such a deep and ancient well that it's often very, very difficult to describe. And of course, we here celebrate diverse opinions, and for good reason, because diverse opinions allow us to understand the various paths that lead to the top of the mountains, as the Buddhists say. So essentially, when we look at Christianity and Buddhism, we often find that we're looking at this paradigm, what happened in the 20th century when people became more open to this idea that um, you can have interfaith discussions, but originally in early antiquity, when Christianity was a fledgling movement, Buddhists existed in the Mediterranean, they existed in Egypt, and we have archaeological evidence of that. So, and we also find early church fathers speaking about the Buddhists, by the way. That's something else that we're going to discover. So not only did they exist there, but the early Christians were aware of them and they knew exactly what they were about. And then later on, we'll discover what the Manichaeans mean and how they blended Buddhism and Christianity and how they influenced Christian doctrine in Europe with Buddhist ideas. We also see what happened in the Far East in China when Christian monks and missionaries came there to preach. We will also see how later Christianity began persecuting people who held Buddhist beliefs in Europe, which was also very unfortunate. We also see how Buddhist legends began to be assimilated by Christians without them even knowing it, without them even knowing that they were talking about Buddha. We will see missionary work in Asia in the later periods during colonial times or proto-colonial times, actually. We'll see the effects of the spread of Christianity in Asia, the openness that led to our modern understanding during the European Enlightenment. And finally, we'll be looking at what happened in America, interestingly enough, which was in the 20th century after World War II, quite a bastion for Buddhism. Might surprise people, might not surprise people, but what happened in America when it came to Buddhism and the way things worked out directly led to the Jedi being inspired by it, in the sense that they are today and how we know them from fiction. Again, I'm talking about fiction, but many of us are also inspired by Buddhism in real life. So that's also very, very powerful indeed. So we'll be moving on. Of course, in this slide, you will notice an interesting image that many of you may not be aware of. This is likely from somewhere in the Middle East, maybe, but we notice that this is Christian Orthodox iconography, so definitely the Eastern Church. And we notice Jesus and Gautama Siddhartha Buddha hugging each other with their symbols, the cross and the wheel next to each other. This is Orthodox style iconography. Um, I want to draw first attention to the lives of the founders in order to establish that they are not the same person. They are not even remotely the same, but they do have similar elements. And one particular element that stands out for both of them is the call to asceticism and their after this ascetic experience, they become teachers and they start gathering people. So we see that Gautama Siddhartha was probably born and lived somewhere in the 5th or 6th century, which is way beyond Jesus Christ. Note this for future reference. Whenever we're talking about certain elements and certain artistic representations, certain elements of ritual, and even doctrinal elements, always note that Buddhism came first historically. Um, Now, Gautama Siddhartha was born somewhere around modern day Nepal. His father tried to keep him away from the spiritual path, locked him in a palace for most of his youth, and eventually he broke out and saw real suffering in the real world. He saw real people suffering, being ill, being old, being crippled. And eventually he saw a yogi master meditating. So he decided that he wanted to start on the spiritual path in order to prevent suffering from happening to him. This was his sort of selfish desire, but also realization that came from something he had never experienced before. He studied with about 3 yogic masters. He was very vehement in his practice and became emancipated and eventually came up with something called the middle path, which is not taking things to extreme, but not allowing yourself to go too much out of discipline. And he gathered many followers. He even converted his family to his own teachings when he returned to his own kingdom and died of what appears to be poisoning, although some sources say it wasn't. But he died in his old age. This is Gautama Siddhartha, historical character, as far as we know. Also, on the flip side, first century, we have Jesus of Nazareth, also historical character. Many people will say he wasn't. We have a general consensus among scholars that he was. So we technically know that Jesus Christ was a real living person that existed. And all the sources that say that he wasn't are generally misleading in many different ways. I'll let you figure out just how, but we know that this person technically existed in the Roman province of Judea. In his early years, as we know from scriptural and some historical evidence, he studied Hebrew text. He was part of a certain ascetic cult led by John the Baptist. He went into the wilderness. He also had visions, just like Gautama Siddhartha. Gautama Siddhartha had visions under the Bodhi tree and became enlightened after resisting temptation. Very important. Jesus Christ goes out into the wilderness, has visions of a devil trying to offer him power, resists the temptation, and also reaches a form of enlightenment. Now, I'm not going to say these two are the same thing, at least not on a doctrine level, but we do see this sort of asceticism that leads to understanding. And furthermore, the motif of temptation resisting. So Jesus resisted power. Gautama resisted distraction. They both end up in the place of understanding where they achieve a sort of apotheosis. Then, just like Gautama Siddhartha, Jesus emerges from his asceticism, gathers followers, preaches, challenges the orthodox, let's say, or rather heterodox views of the religious organizations of his time. And unlike Gautama Siddhartha, he gets executed for these views. And after his death, his disciples still carry on his teachings. So there's a couple of major differences between these two figures. One of them died of relatively old age. The other one was executed, but they are all both very popular in their area, and they create these movements of people around them, which is very important. So we find after centuries that these uh, these two systems actually have a lot of similarities between each other, and these similarities may seem commonplace to us today, but they weren't 2,000 years ago. Monasticism and monasteries, for instance, did not exist, not in the form we know them in Christianity and Buddhism back then. Asceticism, as we've already established for both of these figures, existed. There were people going out into the wilderness and experiencing things through meditation, but there weren't groups of people living in monasteries together in order to sort of be ascetic together. That was a novel idea that actually appeared in Buddhism first and also somehow appeared in Christianity. I'll speculate on how that happened later, but there's that. We also have monastic celibacy. When you're a monk, you're a monk. Other systems that have something similar in later periods don't have this particular thing, but in Christianity and Buddhism, a monk is celibate, period. They are married to their church, and that's it. There's nothing else. Both of these systems have this. Nowhere else do you actually really see this, especially back then. Some others took it on later, but not really as much as these two. So interesting thing right there. We also have syncretism as a means of spreading. Both Christianity and Buddhism have this idea that their particular deity, if you want to call it that, is the supreme ultimate truth, and that the other gods are not exactly real, but then they also take local deities and integrate them into the religion. In Christianity's case, there's the saints, which are essentially pagan deities that get rebranded as Christian saints. And in Buddhism's case, the local gods basically convert to Buddhism themselves. The gods realize the truth of Buddhism through meditation, as said by the monks, and they also become Buddhist deities because they also do the same things as the other people do. But in both cases, we have this idea that we assimilate the local existing deities and turn them into something that is part of that religion. That is, again, a very interesting thing that you don't really find in a lot of other places. Of course, both religions preach compassion as a core tenet of the practice. Um, we also find that during rituals, both religions use large bells, which is also pretty atypical. Again, this is something that you would not find very often, and yet you find it at opposite ends of the planet somehow. We'll get to why that is in a bit. Um, Austerity as a virtue, especially when it comes to monks, but also as a general virtue preached to the general population that ascribes to these religions. Austerity is always a big one, maybe not in modern day and maybe not in certain denominations of Christianity, but traditionally, austerity has always been a outstanding virtue of Christianity and also Buddhism as well. Both of these religions teach this. Not many others around them do. Interesting fact right there. Um, Begging for alms, of course, charity work, and also begging for alms relates to monasticism. Again, monks will always be begging and trying to get people to invest in the monastery. Uh, in Christian and in Buddhism, there's this idea that begging for alms is also part of the spiritual process because it helps you temper your ego in an interesting way. So if you're out there begging in the street, you're not going to be very full of yourself. So that's part of certain sects of Buddhism and their practice, and that's why they encourage their monks to go out begging for alms. But also in Christianity, we find this with in churches. There's special places where you can put your money for the church and stuff. They've already made the process a bit more efficient there, but it's always there in the background or in the foreground. Of course, both religions eventually rise to political influence in wherever they really go, whether it's Europe, America, China, Japan, India. They always somehow, both of these come to the forefront of politics, because becoming so influential means that the politicians, the kings, the governors, they want to control the population using these religions, and the clergy members sort of tacitly agree, so they have this sort of symbiosis with politics that may or may not be in accordance with their precepts, but it always happens, like as a natural course of things. And another thing that I noted here was rosaries, present in both. Of course, start in Buddhism, and we noticed this somewhere in the 7th century, I believe, in Buddhism. And in Christianity, somewhere around the 10th, 12th century, um, may or may not be related. In Orthodox Christianity, they have these prayer knots that they use instead of rosaries, but they look a lot like rosaries. And then now, modern day, it's just rosaries. And in Catholicism, they sort of came about after that, and they're used in exactly the same way if you consider chanting mantras and prayers similar. So that's what they do. They just pick the beads and recite mantra or prayer, depending on what part of the world and what part of the religion you are. But really, this is very, very similar. It was very curious to me to find this in both of these things. So all these elements we find are, of course, first appearing in Buddhism, and somehow they make their way into Christianity and not a lot of other places along the way. Although you will find them places along the way. This is where the two bastions of these elements exist, even to today. I mean, all these things I mentioned, they're right there. They still exist even right now, thousands of years later, in both of these things. And that should give you some clues on how related these two systems actually are. So we'll be moving right along to how this actually happened. Now, a bit of different history, so to say. We know that Alexander the Great conquered all the way up to India in early antiquity, and he founded colonies there. And the colonies that he founded were Greek colonies, because Alexander the Great was, well, he was Macedonian, but he was Greek. So a lot of Greeks came from the Greek world to live right north of India in what you would call modern day Afghanistan and beyond. That's why the largest statues of Buddha ever existing uh, were in northern Afghanistan, and were destroyed by the Taliban in, I believe, 2001 or something like that. But that's why they had giant Buddha statues in Afghanistan, because of these Greeks. And these Greeks came from Europe in the 3rd century BC, but they became Buddhist. And not only did they become Buddhist due to influence from King Ashoka, who sent his first missionaries into these Bactrian lands, but also they became the progenitors of the statues of Buddha, because before this, we didn't have a physical representation of Buddha. He was sort of like Allah, hinted at in various pieces of artwork, but never actually shown. The Greeks, after converting to Buddhism, began to actually represent Buddha, and we find these representations very, very familiar today, because based on these Bactrian Greek statues, we find statues of Buddha everywhere after that. So any statue of Buddha you find can be traced sort of back to this period. And of course, I've included here wonderful mustached Buddha. In the bottom, we find a more familiar image of Buddha, and the coin is a Bactrian coin, a Greek Bactrian coin that is used for trade, representing Buddha, of course. And these Greeks from this space were not isolated from the Greeks in Europe. They were constantly going back and forth and trading with them and trading ideas with them. And we also find in the period that Greeks somehow begin to have ideas about reincarnation uh, added to their beliefs, funnily enough. Um, Ideas that in the river of in the nether realm of the Greek religion, there's this river in which you can go into as a spirit, and then your memories are washed away, and then you can become reborn. That isn't something that really existed in the Greek thinking up until this time period, when it suddenly magically appears. So we definitely see that trickling in, but also a lot of this happening. And if you look closely at the Buddha statue, the one with the mustache, you will notice something very, very interesting. He has a halo. And it's very, very possible that later representations of uh, gods and then Christian saints in Greek iconography feature a halo because of this. It's not entirely proven, rather speculative, but also very possible that these are the origins of the halo you see in Christian iconography. Um, right. There we go. More artistic motifs that are very, very similar, and we notice this. The Lamb of God. Again, this is Orthodox iconography. We find right here Jesus Christ holding the lamb, but we also see iconography that's partially Buddhist, like for instance, here in Pakistan, we find the birth of Gautama Siddhartha. There's a shepherd present there doing the same thing. Later on in Europe, we find Hermes, the god, holding the lamb in the same way. The Good Shepherd of Gaza, this is already Christian art, right? And then further on, Orthodox Christian iconography with Jesus Christ in the same pose. May or may not be related. I'm just putting it in there, but we know that the Bactrian Greeks influenced European Greeks a lot, and also they influenced Asian art a lot because, again, all the representations of Buddha we find in statuary form can be traced to the wonderful Greek statuary traditions that they had, and nobody built statues like the Greeks back then. That was kind of like their thing. Furthermore, let's take a look at this. So different representations of the triad, the Trinity, as we call it in Christianity, right? In Buddhism, we have Gautama Buddha in the middle, right? We have these two caskets here, and we have two Hindu deities that are worshiping Gautama Buddha being a human being, the enlightened human being worshipped by the gods. And you will notice that the representation is, at least artistically, very, very similar to what we find in this artwork found in a 4th century Christian French tomb, even down to the way that's Jesus Christ in the middle. He doesn't have a beard. Early Jesus didn't have a beard. You will find early Jesus without a beard and with short hair, but that's another story. But this particular representation of Jesus even has the same way of holding up the palm that Buddha has. And of course, next to him are the apostles. But again, very, very similar. like I said, Greek art from the Middle East influenced Greek art from Europe, which again influenced Christian art. It's rather visible. It's not super ubiquitous, but you do find the elements there. Um, why, may you ask, is all this going on? Well, the Silk Road. The Silk Road actually helped Buddhism spread very, very far. So we have Buddhism originating somewhere here in northern India. And as we see, this is on the Silk Road. And we see that the Silk Road travels east towards China and west towards the Roman Empire. And also across the sea underneath Arabia and into Egypt on both sides. So Egypt gets hit by the Silk Road in the north and in the south by sea. So a lot of Indians actually traveled down the Silk Road, and back in Jesus's time, the Indians would be Buddhist because this is the cradle of Buddhism. In later centuries, Buddhism would fade sort of from India, but back then, Buddhism was the de facto religion of India, and even today on the Indian flag, if you look, you'll find the Dharma wheel. Even though Buddhism is not prevalent anymore in India, they still have the Dharma wheel as a symbol because they understand the importance of King Ashoka and what he did. And they still celebrate the fact that they are the uh, initiators of Buddhism, so to say, even though Gautama Siddhartha was from Nepal. But again, same area. A lot of it happened in India. But this is why uh, Buddhism spread so easily because it actually came with traders on the Silk Road and missionaries as well. Buddhism was one of the first missionary religions. Again, something we find in Christianity, missionary work. But Buddhists did this quite a lot. And another fun fact that Buddhists did was that they traveled in pairs. Buddhist missionaries traveled in pairs, master and apprentice. Maybe ring a few bells, maybe not. I'll leave it at that. But they traveled very, very far and established colonies in Egypt, funnily enough. And in fact, if we look at this map, so that we have India and we have Egypt, this is the colony of Berenike, where very recently in 2022, they discovered a fantastically well-preserved but broken statue of Gautama Siddhartha Buddha, um, alongside many other smaller statues made out of, well, lesser materials. This one was made out of marble. And there was actually a temple close to a temple of Isis dedicated to Gautama Siddhartha. And this is also kind of in the first century, first, second century. So we know that the Buddhists lived in Egypt. We have archaeological evidence, as I was mentioning earlier, the Buddhists were living in Egypt at the time. And not only were they living there, but they had communities and right of worship. And this is southern Egypt, but they also lived in northern Egypt in Alexandria, where we find people writing about them. So this is very interesting. So we know that not only did Buddhists exist in the area, but also that people knew about them and were writing about them and were actually very interested in what they had to say. These were probably traders, builders, workers, and all sorts of other people that were coming in from India and bringing their religion with them. But this particular Buddha, archaeologists speculate that was either built by masters in Alexandria or locally built here. We don't really know for sure, but clearly it wasn't built in India. this was something that they made there. So somebody that lived there had the financial means to order such a statue to be built and the motivation behind it. So definitely a Buddhist community in Egypt. Actually, not one, but several Buddhist communities in Egypt, going all the way to the Roman era, which also means that the Romans were not unaware of Buddhism. Interesting fact right there. We have Clement of Alexandria in his book Stromata writing about Buddhism, and I will quote what he said there. Among the Indians, there are those philosophers who follow the precepts of Bodha, that's what he called him. I mean, it was the first century, whom they honor as a god on account of his extraordinary sanctity. By the way, Clement of Alexandria was a Christian author. He's a proto-Christian author, like an early Christian writer. Interesting. And he knew these things about them, and he was also very interested in Buddhism. Stramata was something that he wrote about the various pagan religions that existed in both Europe and, as far as he knew, outside of Europe. And he mentions this. And he also mentions uh, about philosophy, which early Christians, of course, regarded as very important. But he says that philosophy flourished among the early nations. And he mentions here the Saramanas among the Bhaktians. This is also Buddhists. So this is another name for the Buddhists. Because then he mentions the Celts, he mentions the Magi. When he talks about the philosophers of the Celts, he's talking about the Druids. When he mentions the Magi of the Persians, he's talking about the Zoroastrians. And he also mentions the Indian gymnosophists. These are the yogis, the people who, this is why they called them gymnosophists, because they were doing gymnastics and philosophy at the same time. And yes, the Sramanas right here again. So that's why we know we're the Buddhists, because the other ones in India are the Brahmins, which he somehow mentions by their actual name. So yeah, he, of course, this is the incomplete knowledge as he had it back then, but he got a lot of this by actually talking to the Buddhist communities in Alexandria at his time. And again, people knew about Buddhism. Now, when people say that Jesus traveled to India or some other things like that, it's not really substantiated by anything, but Jesus didn't actually have to travel to India to learn about Buddhism because it was relatively close to home. This was happening. So, yeah, definitely a lot of interesting things to consider. Then, not that I'm saying in any way that Jesus Christ was ever in contact with Buddhism, because we don't have evidence for that either. But if there's any similarities at an early level, then we kind of know where he might have sort of come across something like that. But I'm pretty sure that it was still relatively his own thing, inspired by his own experience rather than stealing from some other religion that existed. Even if Buddhism was older, it doesn't mean that Jesus was taking something from Buddhism. We don't have any evidence of that whatsoever. Later on in antiquity, we also have actual mentions of Buddha, specifically from the third and then a little bit in the fourth century. We'll see why that is important a bit later. But we see that Buddha's miraculous virgin birth is uh, is mentioned as something important and sacred by Christian writers. Again, they knew about Buddha, they knew about his story. What happened to Buddha was that he was actually born from his mother's side. There's even a special place in Nepal where you can visit his birthplace and you can see his footprints. Of course, if you believe that that's what actually happened, but there's definitely these little imprints in the ground where they say that Buddha came out of his mother's side and as a small child began walking and left his imprints in the ground. Uh, and of course, in this particular image, we see the Indian deities coming to worship him because in Buddhism, we see that enlightenment is even more powerful than the deities. It's something that subdues the deities. Not that the deities are not important anymore, at least not for the layperson, but the supreme ultimate idea is simply human enlightenment. And a human being is still above the gods, even though in other religions it's the other way around. Then we come to this interesting character in our little story, which is Mani of Babylonia. Mani of Babylonia was one of the kings of syncretism. I mentioned in the beginning, we pride ourselves on our syncretic idea. This guy brought it to the forefront, and he was one of the first people, if not maybe the first person, to come up with a very popular religion that was based around both Christianity and Buddhism at the same time. Um, while also mixing in Neoplatonism and Zoroastrianism and a little bit of Babylonian religion as much as it still existed at the time, not a lot. So it is mostly these things. But Mani was very popular in the Middle East, extremely popular. He also even traveled to India to preach his ideas about Christianity and the true nature of Buddhism, and he was preaching this to the Buddhists, interestingly enough. And his ideas also spread to Europe. So this movement that he started was basically a bridge between Christian ideas and Buddhist ideas coming together over this Middle Eastern thing and coming into the Roman Empire, into India, and then even beyond, because the Manichaean movement even reached China, which was one of its final bastions up until the 1400s. So, way into the future. Mani, however, was unfortunately executed by the Zoroastrians, who had become a sort of theocratic rulers of the Persian Empire at the time. And another interesting fact is that his hands were worshipped as the first relics way before the Christians actually had any idea what a relic is, which is to say the bits and pieces of saints that Christians worship and pray to for whatever reason a Christian would want to pray for that protection, health, whatever they desire to pray for. Anyway, Mani came first with this idea. His worshippers, after his execution, managed to salvage his hands, and they began to worship them. The Manichaeans were interesting, particularly because they blended alongside Christians in this in the Roman Empire. They were actually pretty friendly with each other, which might explain why we have so many similar cult elements between Christianity and Buddhism, the ones that I mentioned in the beginning. Um, why do we have so much Buddhism in Christianity? Well, Mani might hold the answer. And yeah, this is something that unfortunately unraveled in later centuries. So we're talking about first, second century Christians and Manichaeans together, talking, learning about each other, Christ being brought to the Far East, Buddha being brought to Europe, but then something terrible happened in the third century, and that was the Roman crisis, when the empire split into three different empires. There were civil wars, strife, a lot of provinces, including my country, I guess, because in the third century, the Romans were forced to abandon the province of Dacia, which they had taken prior. It's a little side thing, but that was because there were a lot of migratory people coming in from a lot of the steppes um, north of the Middle East, and a lot of Germanic populations coming in, Goths, Visigoths, and all the others. And they were warriors, and they were really ransacking a lot of Roman settlements, and the Roman Empire couldn't take it. They were crumbling, and it took a lot to put the Roman Empire back together. But unfortunately, in times of strife, economic and social uncertainty, we see something terrible happening to religious tolerance. Because up until this point, the Roman Empire had been extremely religiously tolerant. They have their own organizations that from the top govern what cults are allowed and what cults aren't allowed. And Christian um, traditional tell us that Christians were persecuted from day one. That's not exactly true. Up until then, they were kind of questioned because they weren't participating in the mandatory celebrations of the Roman Empire. But when we really see Christian persecution is in the third century, when both Christians and Manichaeans were considered to be foreign agents, agents of chaos sent to essentially destabilize Roman society. This is very, very relevant because maybe we're seeing a bit of a sign of this right now. But if economy is still strong and the state is strong, then people will still have a basis to be tolerant. But when that goes out the window, intolerance comes in incredibly fast and changes everything. So this is an important historical lesson that we should definitely look at. So the Roman state actually started persecuting Christians in the well-known ways, but also the Manichaeans. And Manichaeans had it specifically rough because they were considered Persian spies, and the Christians were actually helping the Manichaeans survive. Later on, when Constantine the Great came to power and conquered a bunch of Italy back from the Byzantine side of the Roman Empire, which was a lot nicer, um, he also established Christianity as being a tolerated religion. He converted as an emperor to Christianity and sponsored the First Council of Nicaea, where they basically fought against a lot of heresies. It's particularly the heresy of Arius. And it's important to note that the Manichaeans were on the Christian side, the Nicene Christian side of this particular debate, which again made them friends to mainstream Christianity and very well liked. However, there was another event that changed this severely, which was when Christianity became the Roman state religion by the Edict of Thessaloniki. Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the only religion that exists in the Roman Empire. There was a difference between when Christianity was tolerated, Christianity now becomes the only religion. And due to their idea about monotheism, they began systematically persecuting and destroying all the other cults in the empire, including the Manichaeans, who up until that point were their friends. And were telling them all about Buddha and all the wonderful things that come with Buddhism. Not anymore. Um, Christianity was very, very, very intolerant towards anything that was not their own religion, and it was convert or be converted. convert it by force. You have to destroy your idols. And this was basically what happened in the fourth century. Interestingly enough, we found an account from the fourth century about how Buddha was great, but this begins to dwindle. And as we move into history further and further, we see a lot of hatred moving into Christianity that wasn't there before. And a lot of just no longer knowing anything about any other religion except for whatever the church was telling them to believe in at the time. Um, but the Manichaeans still existed in the Middle East. Of course, around the same period, we find the rise of Islam. Islam also notoriously not very tolerant towards other religions, but still pretty tolerant because they allowed Manichaeism to exist alongside Christians, Jews, and all the other people of the book. The Muslims are not tolerant towards what we would also consider as Christian paganism. They don't like polytheism in any form, but if you're sort of adjacent to any kind of monotheism, they'll give you kind of a pass. And particularly so if you're part of an Abrahamic faith. So they allow the Manichaeans to sort of survive there in various forms of tolerance. But what's important to note for Europe is that the Buddha became a foreign idol. That was all that he was. Up until that point, they understood him relatively well. Now he's a dangerous idol that we need to crush, just like all the other idols, just like all the other ancient and foreign gods. Now in the Roman Empire, we only worship Roman state Christianity, and that became more and more codified with the succeeding ecumenic councils that they had. No need to go into what that was, but centuries passed. This was happening in Europe. Christianity was making its way east, and we actually find accounts of Christianity coming to China um, at the court of Emperor Tan Taizong, no less. Tan Taizong was one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, like really one of the greatest ones. He unified a bulk of modern day China under his rule and started a golden age of Chinese development. And Syrian monks, Syrian Christian monks came to China, and he personally studied their ideas and what they were preaching after they were being translated, and he realized that they are good, and he allowed them to set up their practice and churches there in China. So this is very early. This is again, if you want to put this into context, this is the Viking Age. This is when Vikings were coming down into England and raiding everything. That's how old this is when Christians were moving in. Also, again, other context, the Islamic Golden Age was happening at the same time, and these Christians were moving into China and becoming a thing. And there were a lot of Chinese Christians. We have this stele here that actually commemorates 150 years of Christianity. Um, Unfortunately, it ended at one point, but it was there. It was there. And why I'm mentioning this because at the same time, they also had Buddhism there. There was also some intercultural exchange, but we're seeing how Christianity was treated in a Buddhist space and how Buddhism was treated, not even actual Buddhism, half Christianity was treated in a Christian space. So the intolerance seems to be a bit higher in certain places until it isn't. But like I said, in China, they eventually stopped it too. So intolerance is everywhere. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint Europe has this extremely intolerant place. Intolerance can arise anywhere. Again, something we should definitely be aware of. Now, a few centuries pass, and we find ourselves in a different place, again in Europe. Certain Manichaean influenced Christians were displaced by the Byzantine Empire into their holdings in the Balkans. These were called the Bogomils. Now, the Bogomils had an interesting idea. They were fairly Buddhist. They believed in reincarnation. They believed in a lot of things that Mani believed, like the fact that the world is a sort of prison, and through meditation, you can free yourself from the cycle of life and death and reincarnation and become one with the true light. So this is what they preached. The problem that the church had with this is that they also didn't like going to church, and they didn't believe in any rituals that the church did. Oh, we're going very, very late. This is really 10 o'clock. I don't know how we're going to do this. Um, yeah, still have a lot to go through. Maybe we can do a part two of this. What do you guys think? Because you have to go
I'm
into the
down.
auction now.
Yeah,
I
so
think
I'm
that
not
would be a
gonna
good
Yeah.
start
idea.
the I'm not gonna start the auction till 3:15, but if you want to take another 5, and then yeah, we can pause and we'll have a part 2.
Do you want to have a part two today or some other time?
Um,
Because there's
I
something coming after me, right? So, and after
yes,
the auction. So, yeah.
yeah, it's a pretty full day. We can add one in tomorrow if you wanted to do
Mm,
that.
Yeah.
we could
Really good
definitely do
prize.
we could
You don't have to
definitely
come
do
back
that
me.
if you guys are interested. We can totally do a part two tomorrow, so we don't bite too much into the auction. So we will leave it
Yep.
at the
I'm down.
Cathars right now. As a cliffhanger, we will see what the Cathars actually did and what happened to them. And yeah, right now let's shimmy on down to the auction, and hopefully everybody will bid very well on the items they desire. So I think we can, if we can fit this all tomorrow, then I'll see you all tomorrow somehow.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
So yeah, thank you all for attending, and yeah, may the force be with you, I guess.